In the first centuries of Christianity, early church members would take the Eucharistic bread home for a family who were unable to attend Mass due to illness. Hermits and solitaries would venerate and pray to God in the Eucharistic sacrament. They considered the bread to be the full and real presence of Christ. Bishops carried the Eucharist to another diocese, and a particle was eaten in a celebration of unity. Nuns and monks would begin their day with a visit to the Blessed Eucharist. The bread and cup of wine were held up for all to venerate at the consecration. Now, these visits, processions, expositions, and benedictions were all part of the evolution of the Eucharistic liturgy, and it helped to deepen it and strengthen it. All right, so during the early Middle Ages, the Eucharist begins to play an increasingly important part. Now, there's a decline in participation during the Middle Ages, and few but the priest would receive communion at the Mass. Visual or ocular communion becomes the supreme moment. The bread and wine held up for consecration. Christian worshippers during this period in time would leave one Mass after the consecration and go to another church in order to see the elevation of the host and chalice at another nearby church. This is, of course, a reflection of the people's deep spiritual hunger for the Eucharist and communion. Eucharistic adoration spreads across Europe and really takes hold at the procession and feast of Corpus Christi in Belgium during the early 13th century. The festival, the procession, the feast of Corpus Christi was an expression of devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and a symbolic statement against thriving heretical movements that are occurring at the time. For example, you have the Cathars, who take their name from the Greek word katharos, which means pure. The Cathars organized their own churches and established themselves in Western Europe. They were believers in the impurity of the material world and diverged from the established church doctrine, basically questioning the veracity of the Eucharist itself. Christ to the Cathars was not a god, but merely an angel. And they preached that all matter was evil, including the Blessed Sacrament. So Corpus Christi is a celebration of the importance of matter, the Eucharist, and a response to the Cathars. Now, around 1226 AD in Avignon, France, King Louis VII orders a procession in thanksgiving over his victory against the Albigensians. The Albigensians were a small but influential movement that was opposed to the priesthood and viewed the church itself as corrupt. They are opposed to the Eucharist, just like the Cathars, and a crusade is essentially waged against them by a series of popes and the French nobility. Albigensian communities are sadly massacred, and the Christian sect is eradicated by death or conversions. During the 13th to 15th centuries, adoration of the Eucharist begins in a number of local churches, with short periods of prayer before the exposed Blessed Sacrament that are organized into blocks of time, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week pattern that becomes a type of ritual, perpetual communal effort. The practice of 40 hours of adoration begins in Milan, circa 1527. A parish would spend 40 hours watching the exposed Eucharist. This is, of course, a link to the women who kept watch at Christ's tomb from Good Friday till early Sunday morning, the time of his resurrection. adoration of the Eucharist would deepen appreciation and participation of the central action of the Mass itself, and gave a sense of majesty and awe. However, aspects of the Eucharist would remain controversial in Europe. For example, in what sense do the elements of bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ? Some believed in the persistence of the elements after the consecration. Others thought that the elements were no longer there. Now, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 defined the concept of the Eucharist, and the word transubstantiation is used for the first time. Later in the 13th century, the great St. Thomas Aquinas works out the doctrine. His mind sprouts the idea that the real presence of Christ is inside the Eucharistic elements. The bread is the body, the blood is the wine. But the controversies over the Blessed Sacrament would continue and intensify as the Protestant Reformation hits circa 1517. Martin Luther, the father of Protestantism and the German Reformation, acknowledged the presence of Christ within the Eucharist, but only during the celebration of the Mass itself. After the consecration, the bread and wine, according to Luther, would coexist with the body and blood. This is known as the concept of consubstantiation. Luther used the analogy of an iron being put into a hot fire. Both the fire and iron are united in the red-hot iron, but both coexist and are still present. You have the Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli, who denies the presence of Christ within the Eucharist and feels that there are no changes in the elements. The Lord's Supper, to Zwingli, is a symbolic commemoration or memorial rite. You have John Calvin, who would take the middle path and writes that there are no changes in the substance, but the faithful of God receive the virtue and essence of Christ. This is the concept of virtualism. The divine presence is only spiritually present and is then transferred during the ritual. Now, the Council of Trent, which is essentially 3 sessions in northern Italy, Trentino, from 1545 to 1563, is the single most important and a significant reaction of the Catholic Church to the Protestant Reformation. The Council of Trent was convoked under pressure from Emperor Charles V in the hopes for reconciliation of Catholics and Protestants in his German territories. The Council of Trent makes transubstantiation into official Catholic dogma. This is a response to Luther's doctrine of consubstantiation and of course, the challenges of the Protestant thinkers and leaders. So the Council of Trent plays a big part in the establishment of Catholic dogma concerning the Eucharist. During the Counter-Reformation, post-Council of Trent, Eucharistic worship becomes widespread all across the Catholic kingdoms/nations of Europe and reaches across the Atlantic Ocean into the New World, the Americas. Communities are founded in order to promote these practices, and by the early 1700s, over 200 congregations for adoration of the exposed Eucharist embrace the Blessed Sacrament in all its dimensions. The adoration of the Eucharist is in fact a type of silent prayer, and the Eucharist during adoration flows from the theological to a more personal and real experience. Faith and the fullness of God can take any form, and it's not restricted to what our limited human eyes and minds can see or fully comprehend. The Eucharist is in fact the physical means of a supernatural and divine power, a vehicle for God's grace. Because humanity, people, are not only spiritual beings, but physical creatures as well. Now, a sacrament, well, the word springs from the Latin sacramentum. A sacrament means a holy thing, a gift of spiritual grace through the physical, through sacred or holy matter. All right, with that thought, we're going to take another musical break. When we return, we're going to examine what exactly happens when a believer consumes the Eucharist. And we're going to get into much greater detail about the act of transubstantiation. But first, some more music. This is Miles Davis with his classic 7 Steps to Heaven. Stay with us. This is God Rock Radio.